Our scripture reading tonight comes from Nehemiah 2, verses 1 and 2. And it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine, and I gave it unto the king. Now I had not been beforetime sad in his presence. Wherefore the king said unto me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid.
Good evening. Good to see each of you here this evening. Have you ever been gardening before? Or maybe just planting flowers out in the yard? And you start digging down and you just strike this nice, rich black soil. Right? Just full of nutrients, going to help yield a beautiful crop or a beautiful flower. That is how I feel going through Nehemiah. I typically intend to cover more at one time than I do. And then I start studying and I start preparing for my lesson, and it's just so rich that I can't get very far into the text without us being here all night, which I know some would be opposed to. Bev, I'm looking at you. Yeah, me and her joke back and forth about timing. Yeah, she's already tapping her wrist. So tonight what I want to do is spend our time within the first 5 verses of Nehemiah chapter 2. I believe there is a lot of very beneficial application that we can make from this text that without slowing down and looking at it, sometimes we may not readily see. And it has been a couple weeks since our last lesson on Nehemiah, so let's recount quickly. Chapter 1, Nehemiah at the outset learns the state of God's people and their city, Jerusalem. Both are lying in ruin. Both are a reproach upon God. It says the people were distressed. And Nehemiah takes this information to heart. And then he takes it to God. And that is very important to note. That before Nehemiah did any kind of action to help remedy the situation, he first went to God with it. And said, I realize that this is a problem. And I understand the source of the problem. Now I want to be part of the solution. And as he ends his prayer in chapter 1, one of the last things that Nehemiah asks for is an opportunity to make a difference. An opportunity that he would be aware of, where he sees now is the time in which to act. And so chapter 2 is going to begin with that request being granted. And the first verse of chapter 2 sounds very familiar to chapter 1. And in chapter 2 it says, And it came to pass in the month of Nisan. That is around our April, if you want to think of it that way. And if you remember, back in chapter 1 and verse 1, we were told that it was the month of Kislev. This has been a period of 4 months roundabout that has transpired since Nehemiah learned of the state of Israel and the state of Jerusalem, to now an opportunity is going to present itself where he can do something. So why 4 months, do you think? Why 4 months waiting to do something? There are different theories, I guess, possibilities, as you can see on the screen. One is secular in nature. The Greek historian Herodotus, which is actually considered the father of history. He was the first man to actually record events that took place for historical purposes. But he recounted in his book titled Histories that there was a custom practiced by the Persian monarchy. And on the birthday of the king, there would be a great banquet held in his honor, a big birthday party. And on this day, at this banquet, the king, showing himself to be benevolent in nature, would grant any request made of him. So if you came to the king during his birthday celebration, if you were allowed to be in his presence, because not just anybody could walk into the castle, but if you were one of the few that were permitted to be with the king at this occasion, you could ask the king, hey, I have a request to make of you. And as custom, he would grant that request. And some think that Nehemiah was waiting for this event to take place in order to ask the king about going back to Judah. I mean, his services were going to be required. He is the king's cupbearer, after all. So any event that included the king and food and drink being served to him, Nehemiah would be there. This explanation is plausible. It's possible to envision that, but it's not necessarily supported by the text. We then have what you can call the pragmatic possibility. And that is that Nehemiah took time to construct a plan. I mean, how would it look? Would you want to appear before the ruler of the known world, just all willy-nilly with no direction in mind of what you were wanting to ask him? When granted an audience of with the king of Persia, and you're just standing there doing what I'm doing now, just stammering and stuttering, not knowing what to ask him, that would not do. Jesus actually taught the principle of preparedness. In Luke 14 and verse 28, what did he say? For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? There is something to be said for being prepared for what is to come. And so I can see the possibility there where Nehemiah was just wanting to formulate a plan of action that he could present before King Artaxerxes. But above all, I think the divine possibility is what we need to pay close attention to. And this demonstrates that all things happen in God's time. We see this and we think, why 4 months? We have our own timetable that we want to keep. We have our own expectation of how we want things to go, and God needs to act when I'm ready to act. Isn't that the attitude we have a lot of times? I'm ready to do something. God, you better be on board with this. But Nehemiah was given 4 months. At the end of the day, the conclusion we must reach is that Nehemiah was granted this opportunity and he was ready. He stayed ready. When he ended that prayer in chapter 1, there are some that contend that the entirety of chapter 1 is just kind of a conglomeration of all the prayers that Nehemiah prayed. It's not necessarily what he said in one sitting, but it just it's a compilation. I don't know that I would go that far as to advocate that. The text says what it says. He asked God at the end of chapter 1. He said in verse 11, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name, and let your servant prosper this day. Nehemiah was ready. But the answer to that prayer was, not yet. Not yet. We don't know why. We don't know the situation surrounding it. We can speculate all day long as to why. But everything will happen in God's time, and we need to remember that. We try to rush headlong into things many times. And we try to create things and force results, when instead we need to be patient and sit back and wait for God. Not that He's behind us or lagging, but that we are submissive to His will and His time. In the latter half of verse 1, we see that Nehemiah did not become calloused to the plight of Israel. He did not lose heart. Do we ever lose heart? Do we ever lose zeal or become accustomed to the status quo? Everybody shake your head, yes. Yes, we do. Absolutely we do. But that was not Nehemiah. Nehemiah was torn to pieces upon hearing of the situation in Jerusalem, and he wanted to act now. I'm ready to do something now, Nehemiah said. When the flame is burning hot, and we are made to smolder for a while, there's always the possibility that the flame is going to go out altogether. Nehemiah waited 4 months. What would we have been thinking at the end of 4 months? Maybe we would have forgotten all about it by then. I mean, after all, we're going about our daily lives. He was still serving in the capacity that he had in the court of the king. He could have put it behind him, not given it a second thought. And too often we're guilty of that. Where if it doesn't happen right away, then it might as well not happen at all. Because we are so consumed within the moment that we forget to hold on to things. Nehemiah kept his fire stoked. He kept fanning that flame, knowing that he wanted to be part of the solution. Whether it was that day that he learned about the problem, 4 months from now, a year from now, it didn't matter to him. He was ready whenever the time came. And so now he is in the presence of the king. And in verse 2, we see Nehemiah's emotions come out. And the king sees Nehemiah's emotions. And the king witnessing this, there could have been a much different outcome for Nehemiah. Culturally, it was unacceptable for anyone in the king's service to be anything but cheerful in his presence. It was not permitted by Persian law. And there were many instances where a melancholy servant would end up being banished from the king's court. And if you go back to the book of Esther, in chapter 4, the first 2 verses, we're dealing with the same empire, the Persian Empire. Different characters this time. But Mordecai, the uncle of Esther, is part of that court himself. And he puts himself in sackcloth and ashes. And he goes around the entire city mourning, except he does not set foot within the king's gate, because that was unacceptable. He dare not go before the king, or where the king may even be able to see him, in a mournful state. And so herein lies the reason for Nehemiah's fear. Because he says in verse 2, when the king realizes it, this is nothing but sorrow of heart. I can tell you're upset. I can tell you're sad. And Nehemiah, it says, became dreadfully afraid. What good would Nehemiah do for God's people had he been banished? What kind of support would he have been for the rebuilding of Jerusalem if Artaxerxes had him killed? That was another possibility. A sad servant could be a dead servant. And yet he was willing to let the king see him like this because he felt so overwhelmed by everything. The state of God's people meant more to him than the position he held and possibly even his own life. Now, he did not go in there boo-hooing intentionally in front of the king and trying to create a scene for himself. But what he demonstrates is that it's okay to be afraid as long as it does not deter us from our purpose. Fear many times is brushed aside. We aren't supposed to be afraid of anything. You know, especially as men, that's how we're raised. You never show fear. Well, Nehemiah demonstrated it's okay to show fear as long as it doesn't detract. As long as it doesn't disrupt what your goal, what your purpose is. And we can see that with the way Nehemiah responded. Even though he was afraid. Look what he said in verse 3. He said, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad? When the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire." Honesty is always the best policy. When the king approached Nehemiah and said, "Why are you like this? What is wrong with you? You've never been sad in my presence before." Think of all the excuses that Nehemiah could have offered. "Oh, I ate something that it's just not agreeing with me. You know, I'm just not feeling good." For one thing, that would not set well with the king whenever Nehemiah is the tester. But he could have said, "Well, my favorite camel just died." I mean, there's a whole host of reasons that he could have said what was wrong. He could have said, "I don't want to burden you with my troubles. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I will straighten up. Do not trouble yourself." He didn't try to get out from the situation. He didn't try to placate the king. We should never make excuses regarding service to God. Never make excuses. Consider, Nehemiah was addressing King Artaxerxes, who was, for all intents and purposes, the ruler over the very people Nehemiah was upset about. And he said, "Why shouldn't I be upset? My people, those under your rule, are distressed. Their city is destroyed." That could have been considered as a slap in the face to King Artaxerxes. But did that keep Nehemiah from voicing the truth? Absolutely not. The king wanted to know what was wrong. And so Nehemiah said, "I will tell you exactly what is bothering me." Now imagine being a fly on the wall and observing everything to this point. Nehemiah is sad. You see him walk in to fulfill his duties, and you can tell his countenance has fallen. Well, that's not good, you say. That's not good for a servant to be sad. But then the king recognizes it. He recognizes that his servant is sad. That's really not good. Because we've seen what happens to servants who are not chipper. Nehemiah says he is sad because of the situation of his people. Terrible idea, we may think. You're just asking for trouble. And so now we wonder, how is the king going to respond? And I doubt there wouldn't be one of us witnessing that situation that would not think Nehemiah just signed his own death warrant. Speaking to the king like that? Not fulfilling his role as he should? And in verse 4, the beginning part of it, what we can see is that the hand of God was upon Nehemiah. The king's response was unprecedented. It's staggering to think of how he responded. "What do you request?" the king said. That wasn't how the Persian kings acted. Most people wouldn't even be asked what's wrong, let alone be given the opportunity to voice it and then concern shown about that concern or their problem. Some scholars have gone so far as to say that Artaxerxes had a more mild character than a lot of the other Persian monarchs. And even if that's true, Nehemiah himself would later testify, once he gets to Jerusalem later on in the chapter, he would actually tell the elders there that the hand of my God has been good upon me. Nehemiah recognized the providence of God working in the situation. He recognized that without God, this would not have been possible. These weren't miraculous acts by any means, but they were out of the ordinary acts that didn't happen every day. God's providence is alive and active in our lives as well. There are many times we wish we had more of a playbook where we can actually see God's providence and point to something conclusively and say, yes, this is God working in my life. The only thing we can know for certainty is that God takes care of His people. And He sees to it that we have our needs met and that we are provided for. And then in verse number 4, the latter half of it, I absolutely love this. After the king says, "What do you request?" it said of Nehemiah, "I prayed to the God of heaven." The praying, mourning, and fasting for the last 4 months had led to this moment. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, and now he was faced with another decision. He could either say, "Whew, I did it. I got my audience with the king. I told him what the problem was, and he was receptive to that. I'm golden from here. It's easy sailing from here." That was one direction he could have went. Or he could have said, "God, I'm not finished yet. It's only just beginning." We don't know the context of this prayer, but we could assume maybe it was a prayer of thanks for the opportunity. This was an answer to his previous prayer. Given the nature of the question, maybe he was asking God for more strength. The king is wanting to know what I would like to see done. Give me the strength to tell him. And maybe he was just asking for clarity. Let my words be understood. And maybe it was a combination. One thing we do know for certain is that it was brief in nature. And we know this because of verse 4. The king says, "What do you request?" "So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king." It's one right after the other. This was not a lengthy prayer. There is great benefit in having established prayer time. All you have to do is go to the book of Daniel to learn that. Daniel prayed in the same place at the same time every day. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that, and it is encouraged. Though we dedicate part of our time, part of our day, to communicate with God. But there is also great benefit in expressing in the moment prayers. Nehemiah did not say, "King, thank you for being willing to hear me out. Give me 15 minutes to go pray and I'll be right back." Do you think that would have worked with King Artaxerxes? For Nehemiah to excuse himself? and say, let's pause, and I'll be right back. The opportunity was now. And so Nehemiah's prayer was now. God does not have a next prayer in line answering service. And I think a lot of times we treat Him as if He does. You know, you call up your tech support people, and your call is very important to us. It will be answered in the order in which it was received. You are caller how many hundreds? I don't know. That's not God. God hears us when we pray. Period. It doesn't matter if half the world is praying to Him at the same time. He's going to hear me. He's going to hear you. The opportunity to pray is all around us. Even in the midst of a trying situation, we are able to just say, God, help me. God, be with me. God, give me strength. And He is going to hear that just as well as if you were on your knees before the window in your room at the same time. The last thing I want to look at tonight regarding Nehemiah before the king is in verse 5. Nehemiah swung for the fences, you might say. Verse 5 says, "And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Nehemiah went big. We have a tendency with our service that we want to start small and we want to work our way up. We're going to start with just a little thing, and then when I get comfortable, I'm going to move on to something a little bit more and a little bit more. But if we think small, we act small. That wasn't Nehemiah. He put it all out there. He said, I want to go to Judah and rebuild our important city. This would have been counted as treason for a lot of people. And you'll see that as we go through the book. There were those that opposed the rebuilding of Jerusalem, accusing Nehemiah of treasonous acts, that they were trying to rise up and overthrow King Artaxerxes and his mighty empire. And there could have been less significant requests made that would not have seemed so out there. Nehemiah could have settled. He could have said, let me send a survey crew over to Jerusalem and let them assess the situation and report back. But will you go along with that? Or he could have said, let's start with just rebuilding a few houses, right? And then we'll reevaluate. And we'll see where we are, and if I'm still in your favor, maybe we could go on to the next project. Why do we make serving God incremental? We run the risk of becoming stuck or satisfied between increments. We don't grow. We're happy with our little bit. Nehemiah was given an opportunity to serve, and he said, I'm going to serve in the most, fulfilling my capacity in the most that I can. I'm struggling with my words there. I'm going to do the most that I can for God with this opportunity. I'm not going to just do small things and build up to bigger. I want to go all out and serve. We learn from this section that success begins with praying and with planning. That's how Nehemiah began. Had he not done these things, his opportunity for service could have been squandered. It could have been lost to him. There could have been no rebuilding of Jerusalem through Nehemiah if he had not looked for the opportunity to do so. There's a saying. Some of you may have heard it before. It's popular on decor and things like that. Shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you will still land among the stars. While this is a good sentiment for a participation trophy society, I do not think we as Christians ought to be settling for landing among the stars. We have a much greater guarantee. With God, we will never miss. Never. Nehemiah knew that. That with God, all things were going to work out, and so he went and he served in the best and biggest way that he could. We need to quit settling for doing just a little bit. We need to quit settling for just being among the stars, even if we were aiming for the moon. With God, we will never miss. Are you confident of that in your own lives? Does it show in your lives? You may readily agree, oh yeah, we can't miss. Then demonstrate it. Show others that that's what you believe. Nehemiah had a good plan, which we're going to see developing as we go along. We're not going to get into his plan tonight. But he had a very good plan about the rebuilding of Jerusalem. But as good as his plan was, it still doesn't compare to God's plan. Whether it was divinely inspired or whether it was cultivated out of the mind of Nehemiah, God's plan will always supersede anything man can contrive. God's plan is absolute. There were hiccups that Nehemiah experienced along the way. Problems that arose that he dealt with, but they weren't in the initial planning phase. There are no hiccups with God's plan. What God has planned, you can count on its fulfillment. That goes with our plan of salvation that we follow. It was God-given. How can it be wrong? If with God we never miss, then you will not miss by following God's plan of salvation. Hearing the Word, believing the Word, knowing that it is applicable to your life, repenting of your sins, changing your mind, which changes your actions, not just an acknowledgement of sin, but a change of lifestyle. Confessing before men that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and then living that confession each day of your life. Being baptized, reenacting that death, burial, and resurrection that Christ went through for each of us, dying to the old man as we go down, resurrected to walk a new life as one of God's children, and then walking that life faithfully. Remembering every day that with God, we will never miss. Are you subject to that plan tonight? Better question, have you subjected yourself to that plan tonight? If not, you have the ability to do so, the time to do so right now. We're not guaranteed any more time. Nehemiah wanted to act right then, and he had to wait. Fortunately, time continued so that he was able to do so. But for you, it may not. For me, it may not. Our life is a vapor. Here 1 minute, gone the next. What you do right now will determine your eternal destination. Everyone will make a decision here in a moment. The question is, What decision will you make? Will you accept the invitation of God's salvation, or will you reject it? If you are subject and ready to accept it tonight, please let us know as together we stand and sing.